This is the session on energy trade. We have an exceptionally strong panel here today, and I was hoping, I guess people are filtering in as we start here at the first session of the morning.
She's a geologist.
The plan here, and we have two of us from Washington, D.C., two of us from industry in Houston. I'm Dean Foreman, Chief Economist of the American Petroleum Institute, and API represents the whole of the oil and natural gas industry, mainly U.S. focused, but is the largest trade association representing all interests and started as a standard-setting organization. So I'll do the scene set here today, and I'm proud to have members of Cheniere and Phillips 66, and Kevin Book, who is policy extraordinaire covering a lot of different things. The order today, I'll give the scene set. We will go to natural gas, then to oil, and then Kevin will back clean up. So energy trade, as we've been framing it, it has a lot of different aspects, and it's this nexus of what's both interesting and important. If we look at the themes of the last day or so about geopolitics, energy growth, this notion from the administration of energy dominance, and then the trade war, how it's affecting the macroeconomy, what we're seeing as energy being an important part of that. There's so many aspects, and then the climate side also comes into this, and we're going to try to cover multiple themes from multiple perspectives today. So let's start with a Trump administration kind of perspective. See who you can guess if this, or can you guess who this quote is from? Is free trade really making global markets more efficient? Or is it simply strengthening our adversaries, creating a world where countries who abuse the system, such as China, are on the road to economic and military dominance? This, from inside the Beltway in Washington, D.C., is the theme that we deal with in wanting not to be in the crosshairs, but trying to prominently highlight the trade issues that are really important to our industry. This goes on and it explains a lot better why the answer to this question, saying markets don't run better under these conditions. And the answer is Robert Lighthizer. So our main U.S. trade representative historically has come from this point of view. This is a long-standing agenda. It's been very well planned and executed. As Kevin was saying earlier, the administration has done exactly what it said it would do. But this is the backdrop against which we look at the energy revolution, which at the same time has this cutting edge of, or a double edge of, it's setting exports. We've got record exports, record to supply and demand globally, at the same time as we have low prices. So the sky hasn't fallen as a result of different flavors of trade restrictions and interventions, but it does pose serious challenges to growth. So the rest of the scene set on the global economy, you've heard some of this in the last day or so of where trade frictions globally are slowing growth, particularly in Asia Pacific and China. But this divergence of US production for the second year in a row, keep in mind that the 2 million barrels per day plus that the US has added last year and again so far this year has supplied virtually all global oil demand growth. And to put that in perspective, and you heard this relative to a session last night with BP's energy or statistical review, this is the most energy that any nation has ever added as new energy in a single year in the whole history of energy. So these really are monumental tasks. In a snapshot, as U.S. production domestically, I've just shown here for crude oil and natural gas, the liquid side has gone up, from some 6 to 7 million barrels per day in 2007 to over 17 million barrels per day in September of this year. Our net imports have continued to fall. And for the first time, we're under 1 million barrels per day, so just 800,000 barrels per day of net imports in September. As a result of that, now EIA put this chart up. This is EIA's outlook of net energy trade, all forms, so oil, gas, coal, electricity. We were already, for several years, a net exporter of natural gas and coal. But the big change is this fall of the net imports of oil. That now, as of September, by API estimates, has now just fallen below the amount of gas that we're exporting on net. So we should, as of September, and we look for confirmation from the EIA, as of September, the U.S., for the first time in almost 60 years, should be a net exporter of total energy. So a huge milestone at the same time as we have significant trade issues going on. Now, highlighting some of the uncertainties. One is our ability to continue to grow. And keep in mind, this has been natural gas, it's been crude oil, and it's been refined products, all of which have grown and made tremendous progress. From a market perspective, we've got the global economy having slowed this year. That's one of the backdrops that you've heard as a theme throughout the last day or so. But in the refining business, the addition of capacity globally, if the economy is doing well and the demand for refined products is growing, the pie is growing for everyone. But if that flattens off, we're facing significant competition in Middle East and Asia Pacific of new refining capacity coming on stream. So just from a market dynamic perspective, we're growing as this platform, a premier exporter of refined products. We're hoping for more of that. It's producing a lot of incremental new growth of resource development, infrastructure development, and now the export of the product itself. But the ability to continue to place it globally hinges on competing into these markets, which is where the demand growth primarily is. A secondary but nonetheless important issue to put on the radar is that our ability to export crude oil, which has eclipsed 3 million barrels per day as of September, the headroom for this, it could go, there's a lot of uncertainty about the estimates of how much crude oil we can actually export, of whether that's 4 to 5 million barrels per day is really the range that most have based on market conditions, congestion, the size of ship you're trying to get in, how much competing product there is, or other forms of liquids that are coming in and out at the same time. But if we continue to grow in 2020, our production as expected, we start to approach next year the lower bound of what people expect to be a constraint there. So as we're adding more pipes, debottlenecking the Permian Basin, getting more oil out of the Bakken formation, which has been continuing to grow as well, these bottlenecks move downstream. So your ability to export crude oil, also natural gas and the projects that will come there. Oliver will talk a lot more about this from a Cheniere perspective and their projects, but right now we have a record queue or backlog of prospective projects that have been, in a regulatory sense, approved, but now it's time for the market to sort them out. And most of these are ones that have taken affirmative final investment decisions. They're setting up the contracts, they're trying to move forward, but we've got 15 of them in a relatively geographically concentrated area. And having worked on a big downstream plant, Sassel's ethane cracker and derivatives complex in Lake Charles, I can tell you that one project required 70 to 90%, one project, 70 to 90% of some forms of craft labor. So if you need high pressure welding, for example, one project, 79% of all of that craft labor category in the state of Louisiana. And here you have 15 simultaneous projects to be executed. So Australia and Qatar serve as examples of what can happen when you try to do too much at once. This is going to take some very creative cost containment measures, doing things internationally, bringing them in. There are a lot of measures that can be invoked here, but trade becomes the key thing to make this happen. And from a U.S. perspective, we have 3 different flavors of trade interventions, restrictions, trade deals. Under Section 232, we have steel and aluminum tariffs. And it's not just the fact that these are tariffs. For many countries, they've opted into a quota system that can make it substantially impossible to get certain kinds of equipment if the quota has been satisfied for quarters up to years. It sort of depends on whether a country has produced a certain category of, say, oil country tubular goods in the last 3 years. Its quota is based on that. It's based on that history, and if they haven't produced it in the past, your ability now to market substitute and go find that alternative source can be quite limited. Under Section 301, you're well aware of the trade war with China. Up till now, most of that has just been shots across the bow. For our industry, we've got some 100 products that really matter to natural gas and oil: bearings, drilling collars, electric circuits, fluids, lithium batteries, meters, motors. It goes on down the list. We've had exemptions for barite, a key mineral in drilling fluids up to this point. There's a question in the 4th iteration of this whether that will continue to be exempted, but a very large portion of that comes from China. So the ability of, it's not just the price of these things, it becomes the availability at a point if you're escalating a trade war. And the real uncertainty with China is whether this next step will ratchet up in a way where you're starting to affect the consumer side of the economy, not just the industrial side of the economy as it has been. And the last flavor here is NAFTA and replacing it with the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement. This is locked and loaded. It's ready to go. It's ready to be voted on. But getting bipartisan support, getting it across the finish line when you have impeachment proceedings, and a lot of other things competing for airspace, and where you need bipartisan support to make this happen, this is critically important to a very integrated supply chain for oil and natural gas between Canada, Mexico, and the United States. And we're doing all we can to try to advocate for that, but this is one of the key uncertainties right now. With that, I'm going to hand it over next to Oliver to address natural gas, but that's the scene set for the different flavors and the importance of both the growth of this to the U.S. and global economies, as well as some of the headwinds that we're facing.
I just pressed the arrows.
Here, you're good.
Yeah. Thank you, Dean. My name is Oliver Tuckerman, Vice President, Corporate Development and Strategy at Cheniere Energy. I am filling in today for Christopher Smith, who is the head of our government affairs. He's sorry he couldn't make it, but hopefully I have some good content for you. So, Cheniere Energy is an LNG export leader in the U.S., and I'm first going to talk a little bit about some of the drivers, macro drivers around our business and what we're seeing, and then a little bit about, our company, one slide at the end here. So as we look out over the next 20 years, just globally, demand for BTUs is expected to increase. And, that demand is primarily going to be driven by population and economic growth. It will offset, in large part, increased efficiencies that are gaining momentum, year in and year out. But what is important here to highlight on this slide is where is the demand for BTUs and that growth going to come from? So this is all based on data from, it's basically the midpoint between BP and IEA forecasts. And so what you see here is that the bulk and majority of that demand is Asia focused, almost 70%. And then when you throw in the Middle East and Africa, you're over 90% of all BTU consumption growth over the next 20 years. Looking at Europe, slightly, it's actually expected to decline. U.S. is pretty flat, and Russia's pretty flat. So, when we're an energy supplier, right, we want to be looking towards the growth markets, and the growth markets are pretty far from where a lot of the BTUs are produced and supplied. And I'll get into that in a second, but I want to highlight the key on the growth side is Asia. On the sources of supply, those are continuing to change, and we're now in this paradigm shift towards cleaner burning fuels. And, in our view, renewables and natural gas are the pretty clear winners today, especially renewables. And when I mean renewables, we're talking about wind and solar. They're expected to grow substantially over the next, 2 decades. And when we look at their market share going from kind of 8% market share to 16% market share by 2040, with the other market share leader, gainer, being natural gas, which would increase more slightly, but still increase to about a quarter of all energy supply. And what is at least stood out for me is if you look at coal, the expectation for coal is that it actually declines. It's not only just losing market share, but a flat out decline. And oil, there's slight growth, but it's a declining market share picture there. So given the attractive macro backdrop for natural gas and the growth trajectory, and given that it's going to take market share, it's going to grow faster than the overall growth for energy consumption globally, or BTU consumption. So on that first slide, I didn't point it out, but the expectation is that BTU consumption globally grows at a little over 1% annually. given the faster growing aspects of natural gas and the fact that it's cleaner burning, put that at a little bit over 1.5% annual growth. But the story is pretty similar in terms of where is that growth going to be comprised, or where is it going to come from? Where is it going to derive from? And it's very much, again, Asia focused, where you have of global gas demand growth, 45% in the Asia Pacific region, and then when you throw in the Middle East and Africa, you get to about 70%. Europe, you're not going to see, or the expectation is very little growth on the gas side, just total gas consumption. Russia's pretty flat, and then on the North America side, primarily the US, you do see gas consumption growth, and that is really driven by the natural gas displacing coal and increased industrial activity in coal in the power sector. So again, we have an Asia-led story. If we look at where are the global gas reserves, where is this supply going to come from globally? And you look at the world has plenty of natural gas. There is a surplus amount. We're not going to run out of it. And just looking at reserves as a function of current consumption, we've got over 100 years. But what is the point here that I want to make is if you look at where the reserves are, 90% of those reserves are located, or more than 90% of those reserves are located outside Asia. And so when you combine that with where are the low-cost surplus reserves, which are also not located in Asia or that proximate to Asia, and if we go over the regions that have the low-cost resources, that have surplus supply that can be exporters, we look at Western Canada, we certainly look at the US, potentially Argentina. Russia's got plenty of gas, it's very low cost. You have West Africa, East Africa, predominantly Mozambique, and then you have Qatar and Iran in the Middle East. And then you also have some gas offshore, Egypt and Israel and the Eastern Med. And so all of those geographies are not proximate to where the consumption of the markets and where that consumption would take place. And that is what leads to a very strong and healthy growth trajectory for LNG. And I've basically spent a lot of time harping on Asia so far, but Europe also, we expect to have quite a bit of LNG demand going forward, even though overall natural gas consumption is pretty flat. The fact that you have indigenous production declining across the North Sea, and now you've seen in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands, they've shut down their Groningen field, and so there's a large opportunity for LNG to fill the void due to declining indigenous production in Europe. And so when you marry that all together, the outlook for LNG globally is very attractive. And the expectation there is over the next 20 or so years, you're looking at a 4% growth rate. That is about 2.5 times the growth rate of global gas demand. And the reasons for that is, as I've articulated, is that you need LNG to fill the void mainly in Asia because they don't have a lot of their own reserves, and also those reserves aren't as low cost as other parts of the world. And as a result, LNG is expected to comprise about 45% of the incremental gas needs over the next 20 years, with pipeline imports representing the balance. So backdrop is attractive. If we now pivot over to the U.S., the U.S. has started to emerge as Dean mentioned, to a leader. And if you look back at 2005 to 2007, it's pretty staggering how fast all of this has occurred. The U.S. was importing net importer to the tune of 10 BCF a day. I don't know if that means a lot to you, but in terms of size, but that is a lot of gas. And that was mainly Canadian pipeline imports and LNG imports. And if we fast forward to today, the U.S. is a net exporter of natural gas to the tune of about 4 to 5 BCF a day, with pipeline imports still coming in from Canada, but offset by quite a bit of pipeline exports that are going across our southern border into Mexico, and now LNG exports that started in 2016 with the company I work for, Cheniere Energy. So looking at what is the next, call it 5, 6, 7 years look like for exports out of the U.S., the expectation is there will be significant amount of growth. And the market today, we're exporting a little over 5 BCF a day. We expect that goes to almost 16 BCF a day by 2025, which again, these are staggering numbers. These are big volumes. And if you look at that bar graph at the top left there, you can see the blue bars represent Cheniere's exports from its 2 terminals. We started in 2016, and in 2018, some other terminals emerged on the scene. You had Cove Point, which is owned by Dominion, up in the Maryland area, start exporting. And then now in 2019, you've also had 2 other Gulf Coast terminals, Freeport and Cameron, start exporting molecules. But by the time all of the other under construction projects come into service and this full suite of capacity is brought in service, you're going to have a significant amount of capacity, and we think that capacity is going to be fully used and with all those cargoes being put on the water. So the takeaway is by 2025, the U.S. will be very large in terms of exporting molecules, gas molecules, via LNG, and Cheniere Energy will represent about 40% of that market. And then as we fast forward and look at what is the U.S.'s impact globally, the U.S. by the early part of the next decade will be the largest exporter and supplier of LNG globally. We will surpass the Qataris in Australia, and we think that there's room to run for increased exports beyond the 15, 16 BCF a day by 2025 to at least 20 BCF a day by 2030. And Cheniere is positioning itself to capitalize on that. We have 2 terminals, as I already alluded to, in the Gulf, of which are both operational, one in Corpus Christi, Texas, and the other in Louisiana. The Corpus Christi, Texas terminal is where we're focusing our growth efforts because of its proximity to the Permian Basin and all the associated gas that we expect to see as a result of increased production on the oil side. And so that's why our growth efforts are focused there, although we have land available to grow pretty much infinitely across both sites if we so choose. But the growth today is focused for us at Corpus. And with that, I will pass the mic. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you, Oliver. And with this, I'd like to introduce Horace Hobbs of Phillips 66. Make sure we get the right one. Here we go. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, Dean.
I will second. A BCF is a lot of gas. There's a tremendous amount of gas. So in the past handful of years, what we've seen is about half of the liquid energy that trades around the world moves on the water, and so that's what I'm going to talk about, petroleum, petroleum liquids, everything that moves in a ship. The changes have been pretty dramatic, especially for North America. It's had some significant consequences for the entire globe in terms of economic growth and where that economic growth occurs, in terms of geopolitics, national security. And so I'm not going to talk about all of that, but I am going to walk you through sort of commodity by commodity, what's moving today, what the potential is for that to move in the future. And so we'll start with crude oil because it is the most exciting. And I don't know what the translation is from a BCF to a million barrels a day of crude oil, but a million barrels a day is a lot of crude. And we just started exporting in 2014. As of June this year, we were exporting 3 million barrels a day of crude oil. So we were probably, at least for a week, the third largest crude oil exporter in the world. And that goes from, as if you recall Dean's pictures, we used to be quite a large net importer of crude oil, and now we're, at least so far year to date, the 5th largest exporter in the world, moving quickly to be the 3rd or 4th largest exporter. So year to date, we're at 2.2 million barrels a day. June was 3. We'll probably be around 2.8 for the remainder of this year, so a pretty solid year. And there's really no telling at how fast that can grow. So this is very light, sweet crude oil, shale oil. Any refinery can turn this into a lot of petroleum products. It's highly desirable, especially in the context of the global bunker fuel spec changes that y'all probably heard about yesterday. And in addition to that, it sort of covers all the bases. It's got a lower carbon footprint to produce and refine than other crude oils. I think it's 20% less emissions on average and up to 50% less emissions than some of the heavy emitting crude oils. Where does this go? Well, it goes everywhere. And so folks have been trying this crude oil out all around the world. Almost anybody can take it. Since our exports began in earnest in 2014, about 50 different nations have imported U.S. Petroleum. And so that's a pretty substantial chunk of the globe. No one has a steady diet of it. A lot of it goes to Canada. There are a few other folks in the UK and a few other locations, Korea, that have taken an outsized share. But by and large, it's a real diverse group of nations that import the crude. It's changing as we speak based on petrochemical manufacturing, bunker fuel demand, and so we expect to still see some changes there. On the list of importers, though, the largest importer in the world is not importing so much. They don't make the top 5 for U.S. imports. That's China. It's because in September of 2018, they slapped a tariff on our crude. So it's only 5%. It's not nearly as bad as some of the other tariffs that Dean mentioned, but 5% of $60 is about $3 a barrel, and that's about all you make refining. At the end of the day, after taxes and cost, $3 a barrel is a pretty darn good margin, and that tariff wipes out that margin for the Chinese refiner. So I think this right about now we're only sending about 100,000 barrels a day to China, one ship every couple of months, not too terribly much. And just like Oliver talked about, China's the big growth in demand. China and India will make up about half of the liquid petroleum demand growth over the next decade, and so the whole focus of U.S. exports will eventually somehow have to get back to China. How big's the resource? So we've been growing at over 1 million barrels a day of production in the U.S. for the last 5 years. I think 2018 was 1.7 million barrels a day. The resource in the ground, the folks who think about that a lot tell me could go easily to 17 million barrels a day of sustainable production for a decade. And that's on the high end. There are some folks that will even tell you it's bigger than that. But that would mean we'd be exporting 9 million barrels a day. So we don't need any more crude oil in the U.S. to speak of. Our demand is flat to declining. And so the limit on our ability to export is just demand. The globe doesn't need that much more crude oil anytime soon. And they're just like with natural gas, there is an abundant supply of crude. There is a lot of crude everywhere. And so major producers are cutting back. And it gets down to essentially how long will the price stay low and how much better will the U.S. get at efficiently producing it. What's critical to understand as we go from a big importer of crude oil to a big exporter of crude oil is then the nature of our security concerns change a great deal. And we're starting to see that pivot today, where we need to keep troops, where we need to invest in developing economies. And the way I'm starting to think more and more about the change in where crude is produced is what it does to the growth trajectories that we've all assumed for the emerging world in the future. And so a lot of how we think about economic growth in the emerging world is based on those countries being able to produce crude oil. For every barrel we produce here, it's not just taking a barrel out of some other economy that they don't get to produce it, but here we do it at a much more efficient level. And so what generates one job in the U.S. in terms of producing oil might generate 5 jobs in an emerging economy. So it has a pretty substantial impact on how the rest of the world develops. The U.S. is already the largest producer and the largest exporter of NGLs, natural gas liquids, and liquefied petroleum gas in the world. That's about 1.7 million barrels a day today. And so given the kind of production that most folks expect, the increase in the U.S., and that number ought to double in the next 5 years. It's not exactly clear where it's going to go and what the demand for that's going to be, but the LPG comes up with the crude oil. Shale crude produces a lot of associated gas. That associated gas is rich in liquids, and so out comes butane, propane, and C5s. And so it sells, the price just falls till it clears the market, till it goes away. It's competing globally with some production that's similar, but a lot of it is stored LPGs that have been produced over decades and have just been brought back out of the ground to fill the market needs. That is an interesting competition. It's essentially free to bring up that LPG, but if you think that the U.S. Production will fall at some point in the future, then you might be better holding out and getting a better price in the future. China, here again, doesn't make the list of the top importers of U.S. LPG. They are the largest global importer. And so what we've seen happen since the trade war started is a re-optimization and actually a sub-optimization of where all the LPG goes. And so let's see, now the tariff for 2019 is 30% on Chinese LPG imports from the U.S. And so that is a substantial tariff that has, it's many, many cents per gallon. And so what that's caused is for folks who used to get an LPG barrel from the Middle East to now take an LPG barrel from the U.S. instead and send their import of Middle Eastern LPG to China. And so all along the value chain, a couple of cents are being clipped because we're operating suboptimally. And the price of LPG that the producer in the U.S. sees just will continue to fall to support that sub-optimization as long as the tariffs are in place. Dean touched on refined products and gasoline, and being from a company that's in the gasoline exporting business, I can tell you it seems like everybody on the planet exports gasoline. We just got into the business in the last couple of years of exporting that. We're exporting about 750,000 barrels a day, and about half of that goes to Mexico. So we supply over half of Mexico's gasoline needs. The other top exporters, it shows Netherlands, but that's really a blending operation. That's not all manufactured there. They take really high-grade European gasoline and dump some less high-quality Russian gasoline into it, and then ship it whatever nation will take that product. So our gasoline in the U.S. isn't quite as nice as the EU gasoline, so they can dump a little bit of Russian naphtha in it and send it our way. The rest of it goes to Latin America, and then quite a lot to Africa. The interesting thing here, of course, you probably know, is while we're the largest exporter of gasoline in the world, we are also the largest importer of the gasoline in the world. And that's because of the Jones Act, the 1920 law that precludes or that requires a special kind and very, very expensive ship to haul gasoline from the U.S. Gulf Coast to the East Coast where the demand is. On the Mexican front, you can see where there were a few tense moments as the new NAFTA was being negotiated. The whole Atlantic Basin price structure for gasoline has been based for the last several years on U.S. Gulf Coast gasoline going to Mexico. So should that had erupted into tariff wars like we have with China, that could have been real trouble for the U.S., especially the U.S. refiners. So how's this going to grow in the future? Well, the U.S. refineries continue to grow. They continue to expand. They are the most efficient by an order of magnitude in the world. If you're an emerging market economy and you'd like to build a refinery for national security, well, you can buy the products from the U.S. Gulf Coast at an equivalent price of about 20 cents on the dollar of building a new refinery. So the U.S. will continue to grow exports probably at 70, 80,000 barrels a day per year for the next decade. Latin America only grows demand at about 50,000 barrels a day per year, so that means increasing exports out into the Atlantic Basin into West Africa. Diesel had been the excess refined product in the U.S. for many years. So gasoline demand was the primary driver of refining, whereas in the rest of the world, diesel demand was the driver of transportation fuels. We're exporting about 1.3 million barrels a day today of diesel. That will continue to grow slightly. Refinery creep in the U.S. just exceeds diesel production growth or diesel demand growth, and so a little bit more diesel exports in the future, but not too terribly much. Latin America can probably absorb all of that. And then naphtha is interesting for a couple of reasons. It's a primary petrochemical feedstock globally. Petrochemicals is really the only part of the crude oil barrel that's really growing with any significant oomph. And so that's 4 or 5% per year for plastics versus transportation fuels that are maybe 1.5% per year. So naphtha is also the key constituent in the shale crude. In fact, some of the ships of crude that have gone to the Far East look a whole lot more like ships of naphtha rather than ships of crude. We produce about 400,000 barrels a day today in the U.S. as separated from crude. About half of that goes to diluent in Canada. The other half gets exported, some for petrochemical feedstock, some for crude diluent, and some into Latin America for gasoline blending. That's the size of where it all shakes out today. In the future, what we see the only limit, very much like natural gas, is demand. Demand for the globe really sets the pace for U.S. production. And so it's getting to be a very interesting time to see how that moves, even in just the next couple of years.
Horace, that was excellent, and I love when I see people taking pictures and taking copious notes through the presentation. So awesome. And Kevin, I think you've chosen not to use slides today, but you are excellent in terms of addressing policy issues and speaking off the cuff, so I really appreciate you being here, and I'm happy to introduce Kevin Book of ClearView Energy.
Thanks, Dean. Hi, everybody. So yeah, I think you've had your fill of slides. They were good, they were informative, and I also took notes. So you can put me in that category. A couple of things I want to address that have been said already that I'm going to refine, no pun intended, and build on. Dean basically described this as a threshold moment, the energy security moment we've long awaited, where we become a net exporter. And when you look at what Oliver said, he talked about how trade is imperative because all the BTU growth is somewhere else and all the BTUs are here. And Horace made it very clear that new priorities show up when energy scarcity is over. So I'm gonna take you through a few vignettes, add some color commentary, and then look ahead at the future. My first vignette took place in May of 2016 when President Donald Trump was still a candidate. He was at the North Dakota Petroleum Conference, and he delivered remarks in which he said the following: American energy dominance, yes, that word, the D word, will be declared a key strategic, economic, and foreign policy goal of the United States. It's about time. America has 1.5 times as much oil as the combined proven resources of all OPEC countries. Okay, so he was pitching oil in the oil patch. Got it. We understood that was part of his platform. Maybe some of you weren't watching 1 month later when he was at an aluminum recycling plant in Pennsylvania, where he said the following. And this was in the context, by the way, of a very fiery speech about how China had wronged us in many ways. And he listed a multi-point plan for making America wealthy again. Point 7 was the following. If China does not stop its illegal activities, including its theft of American trade secrets, I would use every lawful presidential power to remedy trade disputes, including the application of tariffs consistent with Section 201 and 301 of the Trade Act of 1974 and Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. What? Okay, now I know he knows a lot of things. You get to learn a lot in sort of the Renaissance man role, hosting The Apprentice, after all. But a real estate developer from New York quoting chapter and verse of trade law, if this didn't make your antennae go up and say, maybe I should pay attention to that, it should have. That's what a trade war in a box sounds like. So, I'm going to flash forward. Before I do, I'm going to flash backward. How did we get to this place, the place where the trade war I'm about to describe took place? Well, it was not the person of Donald Trump, although he dominates most headlines and conversations. No, it actually was broader trends, and I think you can point to a couple of key points. One of them I would suggest was that the trend of globalism, which is the ideology, and globalization, which is the cross-border investment thesis, they reached a sort of a slope equals zero moment where the growth in both trends began to flatten and then turn down in the rate of change before the actual level itself of globalization started to decline. I would suggest that moment was probably in May of 2005 when France rejected the European Constitution referendum. Basically said, no, we don't want to join to be a part of a bigger thing. Most of the 20th century was about countries that had been forced together breaking apart, which is normal. This was a different thing. The 21st century began in this part of my story with countries that had chosen to be together, deciding that they no longer wanted to be more together, especially not economically and commercially, and especially not if doing so meant surrendering their sovereignty. The second point I'll give you is the Great Recession. The Great Recession is, of course, an economic event, but I think of it more as a geopolitical event in a lot of ways. And the reason is credit. With credit, we're all equal. With credit, the richest person and the poorest person in the room can buy the same meal. But when it washes away, when the frothy tide of debt recedes and reveals the craggy and unequal landscape of differences between and across nations, well, then you have to start thinking about where you stand and what you're going to do about it. It begat a lot of protectionism and also populism, and set in motion a lot of the broader trends of which Donald Trump is only part, of which Brexit is only part. So it's against this backdrop that a lot of things were changing out from underneath us, maybe growing fast from a small base in a way that you don't notice, but geometric series have a way of creeping up on you, for those of you who watch this sort of thing. So I'm going to flash forward to January 2018. January 2018 was when the trade war officially started. You know, you saw the message, it was on TV. Trade war starts today, January 22nd. No, No, you didn't. Section 201 of that 74 Trade Act, washing machines, but also solar panels. It was a deliberate act to put safeguards in place to protect industries from competition from other countries. And so if I ask, what has changed between January 2018 and now for the two principal hydrocarbons we heard about? Well, I have to read some numbers here to get a little boring, but work with me here. In January, on a trailing 12-month basis, a rolling year through that month, U.S. LNG volumes were 4.3% of Chinese imports. China was 16% of U.S. LNG exports. U.S. crude was 2.2% of Chinese imports, and China accounted for 20% of U.S. crude exports. So small in a very big market, but a big market was big to us, even as we were growing from our small base. Between then and now, there's been some changes, and I think you heard about some of them, the freezing out of SOEs buying crude, the freezing out of LNG cargoes. So look, between 2018, January 2018 and August 2019, the last month of robust data, that same trailing 12-month average, Chinese LNG import volumes increased 49%. The market grew 49%. The U.S. share fell 77%. And China is now accounting for essentially, or the U.S. is now accounting for 1% of that market. Trailing 12-month U.S. LNG export volumes here in the U.S. doubled, 102%. Again, 78% to China. Same decline because it's the same export and import, same number, more or less. And we're now talking about China as a 1.7% destination. On crude, crude import volumes for China up 15%, U.S. share down 38%. Right, U.S. is now 1.2% of crude, so another smaller slice of a bigger growing market. And then, of course, looking from the other side, U.S. crude exports again doubled, 117%, and the share to China down 78%. China's now 4.5% of the market. If I look at Australia and Qatar, 64% together in January 2018 of Chinese LNG supply, and 61% in August of 2019. I think you can see what all the tariffs can do. They can do quite a lot. The question is, what are we going to do next and why? And so to bring us to that point, I want to offer one more vignette. Several times during the last few months, the candidates for the Democratic Party presidential nomination have stood on stages and variously said things like, we are going to ban oil and gas leasing on federal lands. We, some of them, are for a fracking ban. Not that it's currently legal, but there's things like it that could be done. Just to express what those numbers mean in terms of magnitude, a fracking ban, were it to happen, puts a bullseye on something like 6.8 million barrels per day of incremental production from the U.S. trough, and the federal lands leasing and permitting ban in a one-year decline could take out something like 650,000 barrels per day. So we're talking about big numbers, numbers that show up in the real world. How can they be saying that? Well, part of the reason goes to what Horace and really all of the previous speakers mentioned. The energy scarcity era is over. It's over, right? Politicians in Washington are not factoring in scarcity when they say things like that. They can do that. Now, Democrats in particular have a political advantage when it comes to statements like